Good morning. My name is Caroline Danielson, and I am a Policy Director and Senior Fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today on the importance of CalFresh in unstable times. Today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. We thank them for their support. In today's program, my colleague Tess Thorman and I will be speaking about the role of CalFresh, California and the nation's largest food assistance program, in boosting and stabilizing family budgets. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And if you have a question, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Please include your name and organization along with your question. Now let me turn to an overview of the program, followed by highlights from two recent reports that my colleague Tess Thorman will share. I'd like to first acknowledge research support from Patty Malagon at PPIC. I'd also like to acknowledge the collegiality of California Department of Social Services research staff. Without our data agreement with CDSS, this research would not have been possible. At the same time, the findings and conclusions in our reports are those of us, the authors, and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of the Department of Social Services or the California Health and Human Services Agency. CalFresh is a nutrition assistance program that is one of California's largest safety net programs. It is known nationally as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. To be eligible, families must be low income and specifically have incomes that fall under twice the federal poverty line, and after deductions have incomes that fall under the poverty line. In 2022, this is $13,590 for a single person. And in recent months, benefits have averaged $233 per participant per month. In recent months, about 4.8 million Californians, or 1 in 8, have benefits from CalFresh. An estimated 1.7 million more, or 6.5 million residents, are eligible for CalFresh. From a life course perspective, PPIC research indicates that about half of young children have benefited from CalFresh by the time they turn 6. And while it is not a cash benefit, CalFresh amounts are delivered on an electronic benefits card and can be used to buy food, typically groceries. It does still help boost and stabilize family incomes because food is a necessity. In other words, some of the money that the household would have otherwise spent on groceries is freed up by the CalFresh benefit to be spent on other expenses like housing and transportation. In this slide, we're showing the poverty rates in California according to the California Poverty Measure. And what this slide shows is that poverty would be higher overall and for particular groups without the benefit from CalFresh. So for example, for children, the poverty rate would be 2.4 percentage points higher if not for the benefit from CalFresh. You'll note that the poverty rates are disproportionately increased when we zero out the CalFresh benefits for children, also for Latino and African American residents. And this implies that CalFresh is reducing poverty disparities in California by reducing the gaps in poverty that you see between children and older Californians, as well as between Latino and African American Californians and, for example, white or Asian Americans. These data are pre-pandemic, and this implies, due to some expansions during the recession induced by the COVID-19 pandemic, that these poverty effects are actually substantially understated. Turning to the recent recession, pre-pandemic, about 4 million participants, CalFresh participants, there were about 4 million CalFresh participants per month on average, or about 1 in 10 Californians. As I mentioned, now there's about 4.8 million. Early in the pandemic, the CalFresh caseload increased rapidly. It dropped back down, dipped back to about 4.3 million, but has risen again to 4.8 million. And why did the number of participants rise? Well, clearly during recessions when people lose jobs, then poverty rises and eligibility for CalFresh increases. At the same time, CalFresh is used by both state and federal governments as a counter recession tool to help families stabilize family income. So for example, there was a pause in paperwork requirements to determine eligibility in the early months of the pandemic, and this did lead to the rapid caseload increase that we saw in spring 2020. Why do governments use CalFresh as one tool in their recessionary toolkit? It's a targeted means of reaching low-income individuals who are sharply affected by recessions, and it both supports individuals' basic needs, and it also supports aggregate demand, for example, local purchasing of groceries. Although the program is large, it could reach even more Californians. As I mentioned earlier, approximately 6.5 million Californians, according to CDSF estimates, are eligible for CalFresh. The state's so-called participation rate or program reach has been an ongoing challenge. The participation rate has been climbing according to national metrics from about 50% of eligibles, so about half, to about 3/4 in the most recent national data. But this still puts California in the bottom thirds of states nationally. 6 states have participation rates of close to 100% in the SNAP program. There's also a range across California between counties that have a nearly 100% participation rate and counties that have under half of eligible residents participating in CalFresh. I showed earlier that CalFresh lowers poverty and reduces poverty disparities. One takeaway from this figure is that in many places in California, the program could do even more to lower poverty and reduce disparities. CalFresh is a widely available program with eligibility mainly dependent on having low income. There are still some restrictions. Certain of them have been waived or eased during the pandemic. For example, for adults who do not face a disability and do not have dependent children, CalFresh can have a stringent time limit that has been waived during the pandemic. In addition, for college students, there's additional eligibility rules for full-time students, and these have been eased during the pandemic. There's also a restriction that has not been eased during the pandemic, but which has been, other events have started to chip away at, which is immigrant rules around ineligibility for undocumented immigrants. In California, there are about 2.3 million undocumented immigrants, but if we count the family members of those immigrants, there are in total 4.4 million people living in mixed status immigration families. That translates to about 15% of families with children in California. At the federal level, the Biden administration has issued final rules around public charge, clarifying that receiving SNAP benefits will not make an immigrant ineligible to become a lawful permanent resident. And at the state level, the state has plans to expand state-only CalFresh benefits, so state-funded CalFresh benefits to undocumented immigrants, as well as all residents ages 55 and over within a few years. A final challenge to the program has been prices. Inflation is top of mind for many, and food prices have outstripped overall inflation over the past year. Last October, an update to what's called the Thrifty Food Plan increased benefits permanently to reflect a more contemporary diet and the cost of that diet. So that's good news for affording food in using CalFresh benefits. It's also the case that there's a federal cost of living increase every year, and that's pegged to inflation. And so that will also help families afford food with their CalFresh benefits with current prices. Finally, the Farm Bill is up for reauthorization every 5 years, and this is a federal bill that's a sweeping legislation that includes the SNAP program. It's up for reauthorization in 2023, and so some of these issues could be taken up in Congress next year. And since CalFresh is a federal-state collaboration with substantial federal, both financial and regulatory contributions, any federal changes will shape the state's program for years to come. Now let me turn the presentation over to my colleague Tess Thorman to provide remarks on our recent reports.
Thank you, Caroline. So the two reports that I'll be discussing today explore the relationship between CalFresh and income instability. And this is motivated in part by the fact that income instability magnifies the challenge of making ends meet for low-income families. And research finds that it's tied to negative long-term impacts on health and education outcomes. So in general, instability is a multidimensional problem, which can arise from a variety of sources, including changes in jobs, in job hours, in safety net resources, household membership, family circumstances. In terms of income instability, this is especially high for people with the lowest and the highest incomes. And it's concerning for families with the lowest incomes. So CalFresh has the potential to reduce instability in part by virtue of being issued monthly. And we explore this relationship between CalFresh and income instability in these two reports. First, employment patterns for CalFresh Adults, which we released in July, and second, and which focuses on patterns of employment around the time that adults newly enroll in CalFresh and changes in those patterns over the course of participation. And then second, in the role of CalFresh in stabilizing family incomes, which we released just this week, and in which we focus on the extent to which safety net resources stabilize incomes of CalFresh participants, as well as how that changed at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The goal of both of these reports is to set some context on what we know about income instability and job stability around CalFresh, rather than to evaluate CalFresh policy. For both reports, we rely on access to longitudinal data that are housed at the California Department of Social Services, based primarily on monthly records for CalFresh and for other safety net programs of participation and benefit dollar amounts. We also use some data from the Employment Development Department, also housed at CDSS, on unemployment insurance benefits at the monthly level, as well as UI covered wages at the quarterly level. Both reports focus on adults who are working age, ages 25 to 54, who newly enroll in CalFresh after a full year of not having had benefits. And the result is work that looks at similar groups of adults in overlapping time periods. So the employment patterns piece looks at working age adults who entered and exited CalFresh between 2014 and 2017, while the role of CalFresh in stabilizing family incomes looks at working age adults who entered CalFresh between 2016 and 2020. Demographically, the samples for the two reports are similar. In both cases, we have 55 to 60% of adults who are on cases without children, and about 70% are the only adult in their CalFresh case. About 1 in 3, or 30 to 36%, are Hispanic or Latino, and 11 to 14% receive case materials in a language other than English. Now, turning first to findings from employment patterns for CalFresh Adults, here we're looking at kind of a best case labor market scenario. So pre-pandemic, we find that work is common, but so is instability. 84% of adults who are newly enrolling in CalFresh are workers. We see that they're employed either during their period of assistance or in the 18 months before or after they participate in CalFresh. And looking here at that 84%, we see from the orange and the dark blue wedges that most of these workers have at least one longer term job. So it lasts for essentially more than a quarter. But from the orange and beige wedges, we can see that more than half of that group and more than half overall of workers also have a job or only have a job that lasts for a short period of time, so essentially a quarter or less. Now, most adults, of all adults new to CalFresh, experience a quarter without any recorded earnings. So about 80% experience a quarter of unemployment. And this is especially the case for single adults. So this chart shows that 87% of participants who were the sole member of their CalFresh case had a quarter without earnings, compared with about 70% of those whose cases included children. And single adults are also more likely than others to hold short-term jobs and less likely to hold longer-term jobs. Summarizing a few key takeaways from this report, When we look over the course of CalFresh, we find that employment dynamics are on average similar before and after participation. So the share with short-term jobs and with longer-term jobs is roughly the same before and after. As I mentioned before, we find that instability is greater among single adults than it is among those with children. And yet, looking at those who are kind of best connected to the labor market, so people who are employed both before and after they participate in CalFresh, we do see that earnings rise by on average 70%. And we can't say from this research that CalFresh stepped in and drove that earnings increase, though it is a possibility. Now, I focused here on jobs and connections to employers without exploring the extent to which these dynamics reflect income volatility. So turning now to the role of CalFresh in stabilizing family incomes, we find that nearly 4 in 10 working age adults new to CalFresh experienced both large negative and large positive shocks to their incomes in the year and a half before CalFresh enrollment. And that's what's shown here in this orange wedge. In this report, when we talk about income, we're including not just earnings, but also income from safety net resources. So this could be CalFresh, CalWorks, supplemental security income, and in some cases UI, for both the individual in our sample and their household, which we define based on the CalFresh case. Now, when we look at the point of CalFresh enrollment and how income changes at that point, we see that CalFresh reduces income loss among adults with recent or ongoing employment. But it does not do the same for those who have no employment just prior to enrolling. So in this chart, we're looking at the difference between the quarter immediately prior to enrollment and the first quarter with benefits for people who are new to CalFresh between early 2016 and mid 2019. And what we can see on the left side is that while people continuing or leaving jobs experience declining household earnings as they're joining CalFresh, CalFresh benefits cut that loss by about half. And by contrast, on the right side, we can see that those without recorded earnings in the quarter prior to CalFresh see their earnings go up by about 55%, and their incomes, including CalFresh benefits, go up by 137% in that quarter of CalFresh entry. And I just want to note that this last group, who had no job just prior to CalFresh, is by far the largest in our cohort. They make up about 57% of the sample of adults who joined CalFresh between early 2016 and mid 2019. So to summarize, we find in this report that income instability is common among adults who are accessing CalFresh. We also find that enrolling in CalFresh cushions drops in earnings for those without current or recent employment. And this actually describes the situation for many adults who were new to CalFresh early on in the COVID-19 pandemic. So they experienced the cushioning effects of enrolling in CalFresh. That does not describe the situation for many adults who did not have recent employment prior to joining CalFresh. Instead, they see enrolling and getting benefits providing a large bump in income. This large group without immediately recent employment are also more likely than others to exit CalFresh when it comes time to report on income changes after 6 months of benefits, despite not actually seeing larger increases in earnings at that time. Single adults without children, too, are especially likely to exit at that point. On average, we find that the majority of newly enrolled adults see a major decrease in income at this 6-month mark, and the share with income from CalFresh drops from 91% to 59%. These elements suggest that many still eligible adults are exiting at the semi-annual reporting interval, which is consistent with previous research using these data. So together, these two reports offer several considerations for policymakers. First, the vast majority of adults who access CalFresh are workers, but many experience disruptions in employment. And single childless adults are particularly likely to experience instability. Our research suggests also that many participants could be enrolled earlier, potentially closer to the time that they lose work, and that simplifying or further automating the semi-annual reporting process could reduce substantial drop-offs among the least connected participants. This concludes our presentation, and so at this time, I'd like to remind you that you could submit questions for our Q&A section to the email address that's on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Please do also include your name and organization with your question. I would now like to invite Caroline back onto the screen for our discussion.
Tess, in our research, we see some major differences in the experiences of employment and income instability across single adults and those who have other adults on their case and often other children. Why might this be, and what does it mean for policy?
Yeah, so to recap, single adults, people who are the only people on their CalFresh case, are more likely to have short-term jobs and to experience unemployment, less likely to have longer-term jobs, and in terms of income, are more likely to experience large changes in income before CalFresh and at the point of semi-annual reporting. And this isn't what we expected to see based on the broader labor market. For example, single working age adults tend to be similar to others in part-time and full-time job holding. So the indication is that single adults who enroll in CalFresh are relatively worse off and more disconnected than other CalFresh adults. And this makes sense since CalFresh is one of the few safety net programs that they can be eligible for. I think you mentioned earlier that most other programs are geared towards specific populations, either other populations of adults or towards children or towards families with children. And in a policy context, many single adults without kids could also fall into the category of the only group that are potentially subject to work requirements in CalFresh, which are able-bodied adults without dependents, or ABODs. And the work requirements for this group were waived during the pandemic for a lot of the study period of these reports. And California has a policy of seeking waivers for those requirements or trying to minimize the effects of those requirements. But since it is something that's taken up at the federal level, there's always the potential for the Farm Bill reauthorization to take up the question again of work requirements in SNAP. I think also, our findings generally suggest that single adults in CalFresh are least likely to be able to meet a work requirement because they're the most likely to experience instability, even though most people have a labor market connection. And I think also it could indicate that policymakers could be looking for additional ways to reach and to help this group.
Yeah, and just to underscore your point about the accessibility of CalFresh to adults, unlike certain other programs that have different targeting, it is the case that we saw sharper increases among adults on CalFresh during the pandemic. I noted the overall caseload increase, but that was more concentrated among adults than it was among children.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned earlier that California has made strides in increasing the share of eligible residents who are enrolled in CalFresh, but that there's plenty of room for improvement. So what insight do you think that this research provides into the question of how to enroll more eligible Californians?
Yeah, so I think that we could know more about, and thinking about the participation rate or the program reach, we could know more about the share of Californians who are essentially never accessing the program, even though they're eligible, versus the share of Californians who are intermittently accessing it. So they might come on with a delay, or they might drop off prematurely while they're still eligible. And I think for our research shows that there is a large group that is accessing CalFresh with some disruption, it appears. And our research is suggestive, and I think it needs further clarification to understand what's happening and more importantly, why that's happening. But I think that the question of intermittent or disrupted participation is one way of increasing the reach of the program to eligible Californians. We know less about the Californians who never access the program, but to think about those as different policy issues to solve seems to me a useful direction to head.
Mm-hmm.
So back on single adults and other differences, you found demographic and regional differences. So we do find in both reports consistent differences in direction of worse outcomes for single adults. And you've noted some reasons, including the composition of the population who's accessing CalFresh and who is single is probably more disadvantaged than a typical single working age or single working age adults in California. But what other notable differences did you see demographically or regionally in this work?
I have to say that we expected to see geographic differences, given that we know there are regional differences in labor markets, for example, but in reality, we didn't find consistent large differences in outcomes across the state once we controlled for things like demographic details. In terms of demographics, on one hand, you might not expect to see big differences given that we're looking at a segment of the population that are in the low-wage labor market. So maybe people are experiencing similar things, but as you mentioned, there are some groups that are disproportionately experiencing poverty, and we know discrimination in hiring and occupational segregation continue to be features of the labor market. So in the big picture, we did find some differences in job and income instability across race, ethnicity, gender, language of case materials. But as you kind of pointed out, these were smaller than between single adults and others, particularly in the case of income instability. It was a little bit different for the employment patterns piece, and one place we found that demographics do seem to matter is in the case of income growth. So when we were looking at the participants who worked both before and after CalFresh, we found that women consistently saw smaller growth in income or in earnings across CalFresh than men did. And there were actually consistent, if in some cases, smaller differences by gender throughout the report, where we saw, for example, women overall being more likely to hold longer-term jobs than men. But holding other factors constant, women's highest earnings before CalFresh were lower than men's. And so this, growth, the smaller growth in earnings for women than for men effectively compounds a wage gap there. There's more to say on this, like that we saw smaller earnings growth in the same group for people who receive case materials in a language other than English, and more broadly saw that people in that group were more likely to have short-term jobs, less likely to hold longer-term jobs than others. But I could say more about this, but there are a few other points I know we wanted to discuss. Particularly, I'm thinking about both reports talked about how common it is for working age adults to have some income from earnings around the time they enroll in CalFresh, but also how they likely spend some time without income. And I feel like we haven't touched on this, which was actually a really important point from the role of CalFresh in stabilizing family incomes. So can you say more about how many participants have no income at all around the time they're enrolling in CalFresh?
Sure. So I do want to acknowledge upfront that we're not able to track every possible source of income. We track large sources, we track CalFresh, we track earnings, we track CalWorks, SSI, SSP, and in some cases, we're able to track UI, unemployment insurance, as you mentioned earlier, but there are other sources of income that we're not able to track. Nonetheless, we do find across these sources that about half have at least a period in the year before they join CalFresh where they don't have any income from any of these tracked sources, which is a troubling number. What's the improvement that we see, though, is that after they join CalFresh, that share drops to under 20%, even a year after starting CalFresh. And even though, as you noted, there's a big drop off at the 6-month reporting point, there's still 20% are recorded with no income, according to the sources we have, but the remainder do have sources of income. And this suggests that, CalFresh is boosting incomes in the short run, but it may also be helping connect families to safety net benefits in the longer term. That's, again, something that's suggestive. It's not, entirely clear from our research, and it needs a further look, but it's a topic that I think is important to dig into in the future. So at this point, I think we should transition to audience Q&A. And so please remember that you can submit your questions to PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. Do include your name and organization. And we have several questions. Let's see. Let me choose one from Sacramento. The report mentions that those without recent employment do not see the same stabilizing role of CalFresh benefits. Can you talk about why you think that is? Sure. So what we think we're seeing is, and just as a reminder, we're including CalFresh as a source of income. As I mentioned in my remarks, CalFresh helps families to afford food, a basic necessity. So both in the California poverty measure work and in this current research, we're including CalFresh as an income source, although it's not a cash benefit. It is a benefit that must be used to buy food. So we, those without recent employment, what we think we're seeing, what the evidence is suggesting is that these are folks who may have lost a job earlier, but for reasons that we aren't able to determine as of yet, are not getting connected to CalFresh quickly. And so they're, when they do get connected, they actually see a substantial increase in their incomes. And so it's a positive change, but it is it's a destabilizing change that could have occurred earlier and helped to further smooth income changes, more similar to what we see for those with recent employment loss or reductions in their earnings.
I'm going to take another question here from Sacramento, which is whether there are any findings that surprised us, because I think that, you know, this is not necessarily surprising to those of us in the research world, but it can be surprising to learn that so many CalFresh participants are connected to the labor force. And one of our kind of takeaways from this is that, you know, it needs to be possible for people to keep their jobs and have access, you know, be able to get and keep CalFresh benefits. And this means that, you know, potentially you need to be able to, you need to be able to reach people outside of working hours or have online services for re-verification, things in that vein. But I think it is often surprising to people to learn how many CalFresh participants are connected to the labor market.
We have a question from Sam Greenlee, Alchemist CDC in Sacramento, which is anecdotally, we found that operating CalFresh booths at farmers markets effectively means acting as ambassadors of the CalFresh program and having many conversations that lead to new enrollment. Is there any data about enrollment impact of these sorts of in-person CalFresh services? Very interesting question. Unfortunately, I am not aware of any research that shows effects like this.
So here is another question from Sacramento. In your research, can you see some of the impact of some of these innovative things you talked about that were implemented during COVID to make it easier for people to participate in CalFresh? Any you think were more effective than others?
So I could mention, I think there are a number of innovations during this COVID-19 pandemic, in part prompted by the type of emergency that it was. So the paperwork pause that I mentioned did help people keep their benefits when they might have otherwise dropped off at a reporting point. That was in part prompted by shutdowns that made it more difficult to do that kind of paperwork. Another pandemic innovation was to increase, allow for online purchasing of groceries, and that's something again triggered by the particular characteristics of this recession. Tess, if you'd add anything to that.
No, that's great. I have another question actually for you about the role of other safety net programs that became particularly relevant in the early months of the pandemic. What did you learn about participation in other safety net programs?
Well, I could mention the unemployment insurance program, which isn't typically seen as a safety net program per se, but it was eligibility for unemployment insurance was expanded to include particularly self-employment and gig work. And we actually see this in our data quite strongly, that if you look pre-pandemic, the share of new CalFresh participants who have access to, who have any income from unemployment insurance benefits is quite small. It's under 10%. But if you then skip forward or move forward to the pandemic, to the early months of the pandemic, we see that about a third have benefits from unemployment insurance. So that expansion of eligibility for the population also accessing CalFresh made a really meaningful difference to their incomes. Here's another question that's come in. It's clear that CalFresh is deeply important to the households who receive it in unstable times. Are there best practices to help extend the impact of CalFresh in unstable times for local economies by helping to ensure that the nutrition benefit dollars circulate in the local economy, preserving jobs, etc.? Yes, I think this is the one of the typical roles that CalFresh can perform, not just in this past recession, but in earlier recessions, is to it's not only a targeted benefit for low-income folks who might be facing the brunt of a recession, but it keeps dollars in the local. The dollars are spent in local economies, helping to prop up local economies when demand is reduced during recessions. So that twin benefit of supporting low-income folks and boosting local demand is one of a key reason why typically governments the federal and state government turn to CalFresh as one of the tools to stimulate the economy and to lessen the effects of recessions. I think we've reached the end of our questions. Where we've been working on this CalFresh related research for a few years now, and we're excited about the extension of this work to include some aspects of employment experiences among CalFresh adults. We do anticipate working on related research in the future that could include perhaps the types of jobs that CalFresh participants hold. Could also include additional look at families with children.
Thank you. So we've reached the end of our program, and this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Caroline. I would also like to thank our funders. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining today. If you pre-registered for this event later today, you will receive a survey, and we would appreciate you taking a couple minutes to respond and let us know how we did. Please be safe and have a good afternoon.